It was just another morning. At least, that's what I thought. The kind where you wake up with a headache, trying to piece together the fragments of last night's celebration. I'd sealed the deal on a big account at work, and let's just say I didn't exactly take it easy afterward. My head pounded as I tried to shake off the remnants of the previous night's overindulgence. Aspirin, a quick shower, and a glance at my phone later, I found myself watching a YouTube clip about a distant event, the explosion of a white dwarf star, 3,000 light years away. It's crazy how a cosmic event so far out in the universe can grab your attention here on Earth, right? A new star, born from the explosion of something that had been there for ages. But the experts had said this kind of thing happens about once every 80 years. So the world was in awe. I grabbed my things and headed out the door, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But there she was, Miss Simmons, standing in the hallway of my apartment building, staring at me with a strange smile that I couldn't quite place. She was an older lady, always eager to gossip about the neighbors, and usually I did my best to avoid her. But today, something was different. There was a glint in her eyes that felt off, too eager, too knowing. I tried to brush it off and greeted her quickly, making my way toward the stairs, relieved to escape the conversation. The subway ride should have been just as routine. I swiped my pass, found an empty seat, and sank into it, still trying to clear the fog from my head. But as the train rumbled along, something shifted. There was this odd sense that things weren't quite right. At first, I couldn't place it, but the air felt heavier, thicker somehow. And then it hit me. The people around me, everyone looked the same. It was as if they weren't really there. No one was talking. No one was moving like they usually did. It was like I was in a different reality entirely. I glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe I was just still groggy, or maybe I was just imagining things after a late night and too much celebration. But no, it wasn't just that. Something was definitely off. I tried to focus on the usual distractions, the flickering lights, the rumbling sound of the tracks beneath, but it didn't help. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was part of something I didn't understand. And that's when I noticed it. At the far end of the subway car, standing almost perfectly still, was someone who definitely wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to look away, pretending I hadn't seen them, but they were staring straight at me, and their eyes, those eyes, were not the kind of thing you forget. What was going on? And why did I feel like something terrible was about to happen? I couldn't look away, and I couldn't understand why I was the only one who seemed to notice. The tension built, my heart raced, and then the train slowed to a stop. What was waiting for me on the other side was something I couldn't possibly have prepared for. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The subway ride should have been just as routine as any other, but as I sank into the seat, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but the air felt heavier, like the usual hum of the train had shifted, becoming more oppressive. I looked around. The other passengers were all absorbed in their own worlds, some buried in their phones, others staring blankly out the windows. Nothing unusual, but then why did I feel so unsettled? I rubbed my temples, trying to focus, but my mind kept circling back to Miss Simmons. Her eyes, that weird smile. I'd known her for years, and sure, she could be a little eccentric, but today something was different. She wasn't just bored or lonely like usual. She'd been watching me, studying me, in a way that made my skin crawl. The train lurched forward, and I jolted slightly in my seat, trying to shake off the feeling. I wasn't some paranoid conspiracy theorist. I wasn't the type to read into every odd glance or weird smile. But something about this morning was nagging at me. Maybe it was just the aftermath of last night's celebration messing with my head. Or maybe it was the news of the explosion. The thought that something so distant could affect us here, on Earth, had me unsettled, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. What if that star, the one that had exploded in the T Coronae Borealis constellation, wasn't the only thing out there that could impact us in ways we couldn't predict? The train was getting crowded now, people rushing in and out at each stop, but the usual chatter was missing. It was strange, almost like everyone was avoiding eye contact. Even the train operator, usually so cheery over the intercom, seemed quieter than normal. I glanced at my phone. The time was creeping closer to when I should be at work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced up, and then I saw it. A small group of people standing toward the back of the car. They weren't looking at each other, but I could feel their presence all the same. One of them, a tall man in a dark coat, kept glancing in my direction. His gaze lingered too long. I tried not to stare back, but I couldn't help it. He was watching me, and it felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, but then, as if to confirm my suspicion, he quickly turned and made his way to the door when the train stopped. I exhaled sharply, trying to steady my breath. It was ridiculous. I was imagining things, right? The doors slid open, and a woman in a red scarf stepped in. She seemed normal enough, but then something strange happened. She paused in front of me, her eyes locking with mine for a second too long. For a split second, it was like she knew something about me, something I didn't know about myself. Her lips parted as if to say something, but then she simply smiled and moved on, taking a seat on the other side of the car. I couldn't shake it. Why had they all been acting so strange? The odd glances, the tension hanging in the air. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was off, and I needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. But then, the train jerked again, and I looked up, my heart racing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man in the dark coat again, standing right next to the door, his eyes fixed on me once more. The train was almost at my stop, but now I didn't want to leave. What was going on? I tried to shake the thoughts from my head, but they lingered, like a bad song stuck on repeat. The train rattled along the tracks, and the usual hum of the commute faded into the background as I sat there, staring at nothing in particular. It wasn't just Miss Simmons I couldn't get out of my mind. It was this nagging feeling that something was out of place in the world. Something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to break through. The doors slid open at the next stop, and a few passengers filed out, but no one got on. I looked up, expecting the usual rush of bodies, but instead, I found myself alone in the car with one other person, a man sitting across from me. He looked ordinary enough, dark jacket, jeans, unremarkable, but there was something unsettling about the way he kept glancing at me, as if he knew me, or at least knew something about me that I didn't. He was younger than me, but his eyes, those eyes, held a depth that felt ancient. Like he had seen things, or maybe was aware of things that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the scratchy announcements echoing through the speakers, but I couldn't help myself. I kept glancing at him from the corner of my eye, and every time I did, he was looking right at me. Our gazes locked once, and my heart skipped a beat. I looked away quickly, but the feeling lingered. It was the same feeling I'd had with Miss Simmons, a sense that I wasn't just part of a regular morning commute, that there was something more to all of this, something hidden just beneath the surface, like a shadow waiting to emerge. Finally, the man stood up, and I watched as he walked toward the doors, his pace slow and deliberate. As he reached the handle, he turned back, just for a second, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you get when someone knows a secret that you don't. I blinked, and in the instant my eyes closed, the train gave a sudden jolt. When I opened them again, he was gone. I was left staring at the empty space he'd just occupied, my pulse racing. What the hell was going on? Was this some kind of bizarre coincidence, or was something more sinister at play? The train arrived at my stop, and I quickly got off, my steps quickening as I made my way through the crowd. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but when I looked around, I saw nothing. No one seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't ignore the sense that something was closing in around me, tightening like a noose. As I stepped onto the street, the city felt different, less familiar, more distant. The morning light that had seemed so comforting earlier now felt cold, almost alien. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking my trance. It was a message from a coworker. "Have you seen the news? The explosion at T. Coronae Borealis. There's something else going on. People are talking about strange occurrences all over the city." I stopped in my tracks. My heart thudded in my chest, and for the first time all day, I couldn't breathe. The strange feeling from the train, the weird vibe from Miss Simmons, it all clicked. It wasn't just me. Something was happening. Something bigger than I understood, and I had no idea just how deep it went, or where it would lead. But I knew one thing for sure. It was only just beginning. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't understand why. It wasn't like me to get worked up over small things, certainly not over a random encounter with a stranger on the subway. But the more I tried to ignore him, the more I felt his presence pressing down on me. Every flick of his eyes felt like a jolt of electricity, sharp and undeniable. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my mind racing. What was it about him? Why did I feel like he was waiting for something, like I was supposed to recognize him, or respond? And then, just as I was about to look up again, the train jolted violently. The lights flickered, dimmed, and the car went silent for a moment, like the whole world had paused. I was thrown against the side of the seat, my body slamming into the cold metal frame. When I looked up, the man was gone. Just like that. One moment he was there, his eyes boring into me, and the next, he wasn't. Panic rose in my chest. The subway car was still moving, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks continuing as though nothing had happened. But everything had shifted. I looked around, trying to find some explanation. Maybe he'd just slipped out of sight. Maybe he'd gotten off the train at the last stop. But no, there were no other passengers in the car, and I didn't hear the sound of any doors opening. It didn't make sense. How could he have just vanished? My breath was shallow as I pulled myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. I had to get off this train, had to get out of here. I wasn't thinking clearly, but there was something in the pit of my stomach telling me I was in danger, that something wasn't right. I stumbled to the nearest door and swiped my pass, but the door didn't open. I swiped again. Nothing. Panic bubbled up in my chest, my hands trembling. I pushed the emergency button, but no response. I was trapped. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, the whole car plunged into darkness. When they came back on, I was no longer alone. The man, the one who had vanished, was standing in front of me. His eyes, those deep, unnerving eyes, locked onto mine once more. His lips barely moved, but I could hear his voice in my head, clear as day. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered, though the sound was more felt than heard. like it was being projected into my mind. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to scream, to demand what was going on, but I couldn't form the words. I was paralyzed, caught between fear and confusion. Before I could react, the lights went out again, and the train lurched forward with an unnatural force. It felt like we were accelerating, faster than any subway car should ever go. My hands gripped the seat beside me as the world outside the windows began to blur into a dark, endless void. I tried to call for help, but the words caught in my throat. The man was still standing there, only now he was much closer. His shadow stretched over me, dark and suffocating. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. He wasn't just looking at me. He was waiting for something, waiting for me to remember something. But what? What was I supposed to remember? The train sped faster, the sound of rushing wind roaring in my ears. I could feel it in my chest, a deep sense of foreboding, like we were hurtling towards something we couldn't escape, something I hadn't even begun to understand. My breath was shallow as I pulled myself together, trying to shake off the strange sensation that had taken over. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, the remnants of a headache still clouding my thoughts. The train was still rattling forward, the hum of the tracks returning to its monotonous rhythm. But the silence felt suffocating, like a pressure building in the air around me. I stood up slowly, looking out the window at the blurred cityscape passing by. Something wasn't right. I could feel it deep in my gut. The man, where had he gone? The tension was too thick, too palpable. I pulled out my phone, desperate for any distraction, and started scrolling through the news. The white dwarf explosion was still trending, but beneath it, another headline caught my eye. Mysterious disappearances on the subway line. I froze. It couldn't be real, could it? I tapped the article, heart racing, and my eyes scanned the words. In the past few days, commuters on Line 3 have reported strange disappearances. Passengers who simply vanish without a trace. Some claim to have seen figures in the shadows. Others describe a sudden drop in temperature, but none of them remember anything beyond the moment of disappearance. My skin went cold. That's exactly what had just happened, only I hadn't disappeared. But I'd felt the sudden shift, the unsettling change, just as those reports described. And now, I was the one feeling watched. Like something, or someone, was still out there, waiting for me to figure it out. I glanced around the car again, half expecting to see the man reappear. But no one was there. The empty seats mocked me. I felt dizzy, unsteady on my feet. It was like the walls were closing in, like the world outside had grown distant and unreachable. The train had slowed to a crawl, and the familiar stop for my transfer was approaching. But when I looked out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The station platform was empty. There were no signs of life, no commuters milling about, no buses waiting, just an eerie stillness, the kind you only see in abandoned places. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors opened with a soft hiss. I should have stepped off, should have tried to get out of the car, but I froze. My feet wouldn't move. The air felt wrong, thick with something I couldn't explain. And then, without warning, a voice came through the speakers. "It's not over yet." The voice was calm, flat, almost mechanical, but it was unmistakably human. And it was coming from nowhere. I glanced at the empty subway car again, my eyes darting from seat to seat, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. The voice hadn't come from the train attendant's announcements. This was something else, something darker. I didn't know what to do. My hand shook as I gripped the door handle, torn between getting off the train or staying inside, where it felt like the world was slowly unraveling. But before I could make a move, the doors slid shut, and the train started moving again. Faster now, too fast. My heart pounded as the landscape outside blurred, the speed picking up unnaturally. And then, just as I was bracing myself for whatever was coming next, the train lurched violently again. Only this time, it wasn't like any normal jolt. It felt like we were being pulled somewhere we weren't supposed to go. The lights flickered once more, and the car went dark. The air went cold, and in the silence, I could hear a whisper, a soft, almost inaudible murmur that chilled me to the bone. "You're not alone." I felt my heart pounding in my chest as the weight of the article settled in. The disappearances were real, and now I was in the middle of something much larger than I could have ever imagined. My mind raced. I needed to get off the train, get away from this madness. But just as I turned toward the doors, the train lurched to a stop. The lights flickered again, this time longer, as if the train itself was struggling against some unseen force. I rushed to the doors, only to find they wouldn't open. Panic surged through me. I pulled at the handles, yanking with all my strength, but they wouldn't budge. There was no one else in the car to help. The station was empty, and the quiet hum of the train felt suffocating. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, and there, in the doorway at the far end of the car, was the man. He was standing still, unmoving, his eyes locked on mine, that same unnerving stare. But this time, there was something else, something darker in his presence. I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure pressing down on me. It was as if he was pulling at the very fabric of reality itself. "Who are you?" I found my voice, but it came out as a strained whisper. My hands shook as I tried to steady myself. He didn't speak, but his lips barely moved. A voice, deep and familiar, echoed inside my head. "You've been chosen." My stomach dropped. The words sent a chill through me. Chosen? Chosen for what? I stumbled backward, but the walls of the train seemed to close in around me. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't return. The car was plunged into darkness, and I could feel the air growing colder, heavier. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the lights came back on. But the man was gone. The train was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I was alone, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The doors opened on their own, and I stepped out onto the platform, the cold air rushing past me. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if this was all some twisted reality I couldn't escape. I ran out of the station, desperate to find something familiar, something to ground me. But as I turned the corner onto the street, I froze. Miss Simmons was standing there, waiting for me, just like she had been that morning. Only this time, she wasn't smiling. Her eyes, those same glinting eyes, locked onto mine. "You've been chosen too," she whispered, her voice low and chilling. I took a step back, my mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but they didn't make sense. Was she involved in all of this? How was she connected to the man on the subway, the disappearances, the strange feeling of being watched? But before I could ask, she stepped closer, and I felt the air around me shift once again. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and the world, in that moment, felt as though it was beginning to unravel. And then, the sky above cracked open with a sudden flash of light. A new star, one we hadn't seen before, burned into the night, brighter than anything I had ever seen. I stumbled back, not knowing what was coming next. The world felt like it was bending, folding in on itself, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever was about to happen. "You already know," the voice echoed in my mind, the words heavy with meaning. I stared at him, confused, my heart racing, but then it hit me. Those eyes, that unsettling presence, it wasn't random. I did know him. Not in the way I thought, not in the way we know a face we've seen 1,000 times, but something deeper, something buried in my memory, like an old dream I had long forgotten. He was someone I had seen before, but where? "You," I started to speak, but my throat felt dry, as if the air had turned thick. "Who are you?" His expression softened for the first time. "It's not who I am that matters. It's who you are now," he said, his lips barely moving. The words were clear, direct, as if they weren't coming from his mouth, but from inside me. "The change is already happening. Can't you feel it? Something's been waiting for you, pulling you here." I took a step back, my hands pressing against the cold metal of the train car. It felt like the whole world was closing in on me, like I couldn't breathe. The walls of the subway tunnel stretched out endlessly beyond the windows, a dark abyss that mirrored my own panic. The strange, surreal quality of the situation grew sharper by the second. "Wait," I stammered, trying to make sense of it all. This is about the disappearances, right? The explosion? The star?" He nodded, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling certainty. "It all ties together. The explosion in T Coronae Borealis wasn't just a cosmic event. It was a signal, a trigger, a doorway." He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his presence filling the space like a heavy fog. "You've been chosen, pulled, to witness what comes next." A chill ran down my spine as he came closer. "What comes next?" I asked, my voice barely audible, but there was no stopping the sense of dread rising in me. "The shift," he said, his gaze piercing through me, as if he were seeing not just my body but the very essence of who I was. "The universe is changing, and you're part of it now. There's no going back. The disappearances, they're just the beginning. What happened to those people? It will happen to you too, unless you make the choice." His words hung in the air, heavy with finality. My mind raced. "The choice?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped even closer, his voice now filling my mind completely. "To be part of it, to understand it, or to leave it all behind. The shift won't wait. It's already started." Suddenly, the subway car stopped, the lights flickering back to their usual dull glow. The train doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and I was standing there frozen, my mind reeling. The being, was gone, disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only the lingering weight of his words. The station was empty, completely still, save for the faint hum of the tracks far beyond. I took a deep breath, still trying to process everything. The voice in my head, the strange encounter, the growing sense of something beyond my understanding. It was all too much. I stepped off the train, into the silence of the station, unsure of what would come next. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. As I walked through the empty subway platform, the sound of my footsteps echoing around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever choice lay ahead, it was one I would have to make alone. The universe was shifting, and whether I was ready or not, it was pulling me along with it.